Hello, welcome back to another video. This is Liv, and in this video I will be talking about one of my favorite short story writers, Anton Chekhov, and a lot of his stories have made a great impact on me. Firstly, in summarizing a few key traits regarding his style, I would say that his story is mostly in succinct language. There are no internal monologues of great length or very detailed conveyances of emotion, and this is precisely how he is able to convey really subtle revelations about humanity through his stories. He rarely takes a very explicit stance, although through most of the stories you could get a sense of what his stance is that's coming through, but he doesn't really explicitly put it forth in the sense of truisms like writers such as Flaubert or Thackeray would do. This is precisely what gives his stories a sense of inconclusiveness, as Virginia Woolf says that a lot of Russian writers tend to have, a sort of inconclusiveness about life. And lastly, the subject matter of his story is mainly lower to middle class people, with a particular focus on the Russian peasantry. Let's start with Ward No. 6. So I think this is probably his favourite story that I've read, and it's also the first one of Chekhov's story that I've read. It's taught me so much about life and given me insight in a particular area, which I think can be very simply summarized in a nutshell as a lesson against Stoicism. The key belief of Stoicism is that virtue itself should be enough to guarantee happiness in life, and all other regards, such as goods or other objects of pursuit in life, should be treated with indifference because they are trivial. We see that from the beginning of the story, its protagonist, Andrei Yefimich, a doctor working for an asylum ward, takes an attitude which mixes indifference and stoicism towards the sufferings of the patients in the ward that he overlooks. And he also takes a similar attitude towards just going through life and suffering in general. Andrei supports this idea because he thinks the divinity of the human mind, or something we could call the spiritual, the intellectual, itself should be everything that matters to a virtuous person. One should be able to enjoy these aspects of life and engage in those deep, meaningful contemplations regardless of one's circumstances. So he says, in any surroundings you can find tranquility in yourself, free and deep thinking which strives for the comprehension of life and complete contempt for the foolish bustle of the world. Those two are blessings beyond any that man has ever known, and you can possess them even though you lived behind 3 4 bars. However, on the opposite spectrum, a lunatic that lives in the ward, called Ivan Dmitrich, he rejects Andrei's philosophy that we should slight suffering as something unimportant or something capable of being ignored by retreating into the intellect, and he argues, to harden oneself by suffering to such a point that one loses all sensibility to it, that is, to cease to live. And to despise suffering would mean to it despising life itself. The whole of life lies in these sensations. I think Ivan's view can be largely supported by the fact that we all are corporal creatures, and our existences are fundamentally rooted in physicality. As the story progresses, Andrei's beliefs and actions increase in oddity, and as a result, he is convicted into the ward. In the ward, he personally goes through the harsh conditions and the very disrespectful, abusive treatment that the patients have been through, and towards such treatment he used to be quite indifferent. But after going through these personally, he reflects, I used to be indifferent, I reasoned boldly and loudly, but at the first coarse touch of life upon me I have lost heart. I think the story gives a very sound answer to a sort of internal debate about whether people should and do in fact have the capacity to just focus on the spiritual without regard to the physical. The answer that it gives is no. In circumstances where a person is stripped of the freedom and dignity given to any respected individual or is subjected to strong physical pain, it is no longer possible to hold one's mind aloof from the physical circumstances. In this state, it's almost impossible to conduct one's mind towards the nourishment of thoughts and everything that is deemed as the loftier intellectual or spiritual pursuits. This is because a lot of the times physical deprivations deprive one of the ability to feel human, and I would say that is the conditions of a lot of people in labor or concentration camps. And when you're deprived of the ability to feel human, naturally it is very difficult for you to undertake a lot of intellectual reflections that are distinctly human. This story is essentially one about irony. So it examines the behaviors of its characters through the lenses of irony, and it reveals a lot of human hypocrisies. Basically, the story is about a young peasant called Kirilla, who is engaged in a process of complaint towards the authorities to release his brother Vaska from imprisonment, so that Vaska could work to support their family. In his pleading, Kirilla says, I am Vaska's brother, you see. Father has the 2 of us, him, Vaska, and me, Kirilla. Besides us, there are 3 sisters, and Vaska's a married man with a little one. There are a lot of us and no one to work. In the smithy, it's nearly 2 years now since the fort has been heated. I am at the cotton factory. I can't do smith's work. And how can father work? Let alone work. He can't eat properly. He can't lift a spoon to his mouth. Via this passage and a lot of other significant details of the story, we see the first irony. There are various people in his family, including himself, who are actually able to work or to learn to do new work. But instead, they refuse to do so and just choose to blame the situation of poverty on one simple fact, that is, Vaska is imprisoned and unable to work. The second irony concerns the nature of bureaucracy. So in this system, each person wants as little responsibility as possible. So none of them thinks it's their responsibility to deal with Vaska's imprisonment. So Kirilla says, I've been to the courts, I have tried to send in a petition, they wouldn't take a petition. I have been to the police captain and I have been to the examining magistrate, and everyone says, it is not my business. Whose business is it then? And finally, there is the third irony. Kirilla believes that Vaska was imprisoned for nothing. In his exact words, he said his brother was imprisoned for nothing. But when he describes his brother's crime, we realize it's not really nothing. He was drunk, Your Honor, and did not know what he was doing, and even hit father on the ear and scratched his own cheek on a branch, and two of our fellows, they wanted some Turkish tobacco, you see, began telling him to go with them and break into the Armenian shop at night for tobacco. Being drunk, he obeyed them, the fool. They broke the lock, got in and did no end of mischief. They turned everything upside down and broke the windows and scattered the flour about. They were drunk, that is all one can say. In summary, this story reveals the human tendency to shy away from taking responsibility in all respects. Whether it be like pulling one's life together, taking on the responsibilities of one's job, or acknowledging and repenting for their crimes. This story has a similar theme to the previous one, so it also reveals people's innate refusal to take responsibility for their circumstances. But in the meantime, they tend to put this sort of double standard on other people and think others should bear responsibility for whatever sort of horrible situation they're in. So we have Skvortsov, who is a lawyer, and apologies if I don't pronounce the Russian name right because I don't know how to pronounce it. So let's go with Skvortsov. So he represents the attitude held by the majority of the middle upper class that the poor are in such bad circumstances because they deserve it. So it's because of their own laziness or inadequacy. So he says to the beggar in the story, you are young, strong, and healthy and could always find work if you wanted to, but you are lazy, pampered, drunken. You reek of vodka like a pothouse. You have become false and corrupt to the marrow of your bones and fit for nothing but begging and lying. However, on the other hand, the beggar Lushkov himself views his misfortune as something that should be blamed on circumstances outside of his control. So he gives a list of reasons why he is unable to go find work. So here we see a pushing around of responsibility, so Skvortsov pushing it onto Lushkov and Lushkov pushing it onto just circumstances in general. This small interaction between the two people is illustrative of a wider political discussion about whether the poor deserves to be poor because of their innate characteristics or lack of capacity. And accompanied is the question of what extent do the more well-off middle and upper class have a responsibility of helping those poor. Interestingly, at the end of the story, Lushkov does acquire a job at the notary's office, and he claims that Skvortsov's cook, Olga, was the person who pulled him out of the poverty. And he says, how often she upsets herself and how many tears she shed over me, I can't tell you. But what affected me the most, she chopped the wood for me. How it was that she saved me. How it was I changed looking at her and gave up drinking, I can't explain. I only know that what she said and the noble way she behaved brought about a change in my soul, and I shall never forget it. Firstly, I wish to note that Olga is representative of a sort of female character that appears in a lot of Russian fiction. Particularly those written by men, because most of the Russian classics are by male authors. I haven't actually read a not so contemporary Russian classic that is written by a female. It's quite interesting. So this sort of woman is someone who is full of compassion for others, entirely unselfish, and would devote herself to helping or serving others, in particular others who are men, and they take this to extreme extents. So many Russian writers have portrayed this sort of female character as a sort of salvation figure to lift man out of their moral degradation or physical degradation. Yet on a broader level, we may interpret Olga as representing the sort of sympathy, kindness, and assistance that we should give to the suffering poorer class. They should receive both emotional and material support in order to be lifted out of their circumstances. With the story, we are moving on to a different theme. So one about love, desire, and human intimacies. So we have a middle-aged man called Dmitry Gurov, who is fascinated by a young woman, Anna Sergeyevna, who often walks her dog in front of the Yalta River where he is staying on vacation. So he starts an affair with her, and via this affair, Chekhov explores several key ideas that are frequently at play in relation to our desires and relationships. Firstly, we see that Dmitry's desire for Anna is rooted in a sense of curiosity or just being drawn towards what is mysterious and unattained. This is kind of combined with his romanticized view of a young, beautiful woman, which reeks of innocence. So he says, and judging others by himself, he did not believe the things he saw and assumed that everybody else also had his real vital life passing under a veil of mystery, as under the cover of the night. Every man's intimate existence is kept mysterious, and perhaps in part because of that, civilized people are so nervously anxious that a personal secret should be respected. I tend to interpret that this affair with Anna gives him a sort of access to the real vital life that he idealizes and believes must exist beyond like the mundanity of his life working and just doing his everyday stuff in Moscow. He believes that there definitely has to be more to life than this just boring everyday activity. Yet the affair also fills both of them with anxiety due to its uncertainty, their inability to, conduct their love in public, and also Anna is tormented by the guilt she feels towards her husband for cheating on him. However, this sort of anxiety further strengthens the allure of their relationship because it is hinged on the idea of an ideal future together that is yet unrealized, but they believe it must be able of being realized, and they do look forward to that ideal future together. And this is the human tendency to always idealize the unattained. The story does end with a rather interesting passage. And it seems that but a little while and the solution would be found and there would begin a lovely new life. And to both of them, it was clear that the end was still very far off and that the hardest and most difficult period was only just beginning. So in this passage, it is the very final part and we see that there's no sense of finish. There's only a sense of strong anticipation. And this anticipation involves a mixture of optimism and pessimism. It is as if Chekhov is saying, it is only the suspended stage of hope and uncertainty that is most desirable or beautiful about their relationship. If they know everything there is to know about each other, and they know there's nothing much more that is left unexplored about their relationship, then I think the mystic allure that really holds them together would disappear, and they would end up just simply treating this relationship as something just as mundane as every other aspect of their lives. The protagonist of this last story, The Darling, is called Olenka, and I would say she is very much the salvation-giving female figure that I have previously mentioned. However, what is interesting is the story departs from her point of view rather than the man to whom she is devoted. And I think this raises two important points. The first point is that we need to examine the internal impacts on her via the sort of blind devotion to others. And the second is the external impact to the men to whom she is devoted. There are three key men in Olenka's life to whom she is devoted. So the first two, we have Kukin, a theatre manager, and Pustovalov, a merchant. She married them consecutively. We also have the third man, Smirnov, a veterinarian she did not marry but spent some time in intimacy with. So during her time with each man, she respectively took on their areas of interest and the personality they hold. So she became enthusiastic about theatre when she married Kukin, and about trade when she was with Pustovalov, and at last about medical science when she was with Smirnov. So for example, this passage from the story really illustrates it. Her husband's opinions were all hers. If he thought the room was too hot, she thought so too. If he thought business was dull, she thought business was dull. Pustovalov was not fond of amusements and stayed home on holidays. She did the same. Each time, after the death of each husband and after Smirnov temporarily departs, she fell into a state of mental oblivion and despair. In the evening, Olenka sat on the steps and heard the music playing and the rockets bursting in the Tivoli, but it no longer aroused any response in her. She looked listlessly into the yard, thought of nothing, wanted nothing, and when night came on, she went to bed and dreamed of nothing but the empty yard. She ate and drank as though by compulsion, and what was worst of all, she no longer had any opinions. She saw and understood everything that went on around her, but she could not form an opinion about it. She knew of nothing to talk about. So these passages clearly demonstrate the internal state of these salvation figure unselfish women. Olenka is merely an empty vessel that must be filled by the personality of another, and its detrimental impact on her is that she must constantly be seeking such person to fill her interiority, otherwise she falls into despair. However, the external impact of her devotion on these men is actually less clear in the story. So for the three men, they don't seem to really enjoy or dislike her devotion. In fact, they sort of take it for granted as part of just their lives and how it should be. And this is where the irony lies. Her devotion has no significant impact on them. And I think one of the main messages of this story is that the devoted female figure, contrary to the depiction of many authors, is probably not able to give any sort of salvation to the men, because her impact is so trivialized, and that is precisely her tragedy. Near the end of the story, the subject of Olenka's devotion turns to Smirnov's young son, Sasha, and her love takes on a more motherly and possessive aspect. In this case, Chekhov does provide a clear reaction from Sasha towards her devotion. He sees it as suffocating because she really is imposing and possessive of him. Hence, the story really portrays her as a sort of martyr figure, this devoted female without any sense of self, and it is ultimately a tragedy. These are a few of my favourite stories from Chekhov. It is definitely not a conclusive summary because I would say I've read probably less than half of his stories. There's just so many of them. I have also mentioned a few other ones of his stories in my June reading summary video, which I've linked here, so if you're interested, please check that out. Chekhov has written a wealth of really insightful stories that I would definitely recommend anyone to check out. They're usually really simple to understand and they're quite short, so there's no too much time commitment. Finally, thank you for watching this video and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed my channel.